There is a very weird, wearisome monotony in the oft repeated tale of military instructions, but the formidable mutiny of the Sipahis, which convulsed Constantinople in the ninth year of Amura's reign, deserves notice on account of traits of Turkish character, which its chief hero and victim remarkably displayed, and also because it explains and partly palli- palliates the hard-heartedness which grew up Amurat, and the almost wolfish appetite for bloodshed which was shown by him in the remainder of his reign. In the beginning of that year, a large number of munitions spies who had disgraced themselves by gross misconduct in the late unsuccessful campaign against Baghdad had straggled to Constantinople and joined the European spies already collected in that capital. They were secretly instigated by Recep Pasha, who wished by their means to effect the ruin of Grand Vizier Hafiz, a gallant though not fortunate general, to whom the young Sultan was much attached and who had interchanged potential communications with his sovereign when employed against the Persians. The spies gathered together in the hippodrome on three successive days. February 1632, and called for the heat of the Grand Vizier of the Mufti Yahya, the Defterdar Mustafa, and other favorites of the Sultan, 17 in all. The shops were closed, and the city and the Sarail were in terror. On the second day, the mutineers came to the gate of palace, but withdrew on being promised that they should have redress on the morrow. On the third day, when the morning broke, the outer court of the seraglio was filled with raging rebels. As the Grand Vizier Hafiz was on his way thither to attend the divan, he received a message from a friend who warned him to conceal himself until the crowd had dispersed. Hafiz answered with a smile, "I have already this day seen my fate in a dream. I am not afraid to die." As they rode as he rode into the seraglio, the multitude made a lane for him, as if out of respect, but as he passed along, they cast stones at him. He was struck from his horse and borne by his attendants into the inner part of the palace. One of his followers was murdered and one grievously wounded by Sipahis. The Sultan ordered Hafiz to make the escape, and the Grand Vizier took a boat at the water gate of the Serail and crossed over to Scutari. Meanwhile, the rebels forced their way into the second court of the Seraglio, which was the usual hall of the divan, and they clamoured for the Sultan to come forth and hold a divan among them. The Sultan appeared and held a divan standing. He spoke to the mutineers. "What is your will, my servants?" Loudly and insolently they answered. "Give us the 17 heads, give these men up to us, that we may tear them in pieces, or it shall fare worse with thee." They pressed close up on the Sultan and were near upon laying hands on him. You give no hearing to my words. Why have you called me hither? Said Amurath. He drew back, surrounded by his pages, into the inner court. The rebels came after him like a raging flood. Fortunately, the pages barred the gate, but the alarm and the outrage became the greater. They shouted aloud, "The 17 heats or abdicate!" Recep Pasha, the secret promoter of the whole tumult, now approached the young Sultan and urged on him that it was necessary to still the tumult by granting what was demanded. He said that it had become a custom for the chiefs to be given up to the soldiery. The unchanged slave must take what he pleases. Better the heat of the vizier than that of the sultan. Amurath sorrowfully fully gave him and sent a summons to Hafiz to return and die. The vizier hesitated not, and he came back. The sultan met him at the water gate. The gate of the inner court was then opened. The sultan ascended the throne of state, and 4 deputies from the insurgents, 2 Spahis and 2 Janissaries, came before him. He implored them not to profane the honor of the caliphate. But he pleaded in vain. The cry was still, "The 17 heats." Meanwhile Hafiz Pasha he made the ablution preparatory to it, which the Mahometan law requires, and he now stood forth and addressed Amurath. "My Padishah," said he, "let 1,000 slaves, such as Hafiz, perish for the sake. I only entreat that thou do not thyself put me to death, but give me up to this man, that I may die a martyr, and that my innocent blood may come upon their heads. Let my body be buried ex Scutari." He then kissed the earth and exclaimed, "In the name of God, all the merciful, the all God, there is no power or might save with God, the Most High, the Almighty. His we are, and unto him we return." Hafiz then strode forth a hero into the fatal court. The Sultan sobbed aloud. The pages wept bitterly, the viziers gazed with tearful eyes. The rebels rushed to meet him as he advanced. To sell his life as a martyr, he struck the foremost to the ground with a well-aimed buffet, on which the rest sprang on him with their daggers, and pierced him with 17 mortal wounds. The Janissaries kneeled in his breast and struck off his head. The page of the seraglio came forward and spread a robe over the corpse. Then said the Sultan, "God's will be done. But in his appointed time ye shall meet with vengeance, ye men of blood, who have neither the fear of God before your eyes, nor respect for the law of the Prophet." The threat was little heeded at the time, but it was uttered by one who never meant it in vain. Within 2 months after this scene, fresh victims had fallen before the bloodthirsty rebel that now disgraced his name of Turkish troops. The The position of Amurath was openly discussed in their barracks, and the young Sultan saw that the terrible alternative, kill or be killed, was no longer to be evaded. Some better spirits in the army, shamed and heartsick at the spirit of brigandage that was so insolently dominant over court and camp, placed their swords at their sovereign disposal, and a small but brave force that could be relied on in the hour of need was gradually and quietly organized. The dissensions also among the Mucinos troops themselves, and especially the ancient jealousy between the Sipahis and the Janissaries offered means for repressing them all, of which Amurath availed himself with boldness and skill. His first act was to put the arch- architector Recep Pasha suddenly and secretly to death. He then proceeded to the more difficult and one reducing the army to submission. This was one of the 29th day of May, 1632, the day on which the Sultan emancipated himself from his military tyrants and commenced also his own reign of terror. Amurath held a public divan on the shore of the sea near the kiosk of Sinan. The Mufti, the Viziers, and the chief member of the Ulema were there, and the two military chiefs who had devoted themselves to the cause of the Sultan against the munitions troops, Qusay Mohammed and Rum Mohammed, six squadrons or four squads whose loyalty could be trusted, were also in attendance and ready for immediate action. Amurath seated himself on the throne and sent a message to the Sipahis who were assembled in the hippodrome, requiring the attendance of a deputation of their officers. Amurath then summoned the Janissaries before him and addressed them as faithful troops who were enemies to the rebels in the other corps. The Janissaries shouted out that the Padishah's enemies were their enemies also, and took with zealous readiness and oaths of implicit obedience which was suggested at the moment. Copies of the Koran were ready and were handed through the ranks. The Janissaries swore on the sacred book, by God, with God, and through God. Their oath was formally registered, and Amurath then turned to the deputies of the Sipahis who had by this time arrived and had witnessed the loyal favor of the Janissaries. The Sultan reproached them for the rapacity and lawlessness of their body. They answered humbly that the Sultan's charge were true, but that they were personally loyal, so unable to make their men obey them. If ye are loyal, said Amurath, take the oath which your brethren, the Janissaries, have taken and deliver up to me the ringleaders of rebellion from your ranks. Surrounded by the royal horse guards and Janissaries, the Spahi officers obeyed in fear and trembling. Amurath then ordered the judge to stand forward. He said to them, "Ye are accused of selling your judgment for gold and of destroying my people. What answer have you to give?" "God is our witness," said they, "that we seek not to make a traffic of justice or to oppress the poor. But we have no freedom or independence, and if we protect their subjects against the violence of the spies and the tax gatherers, we are accused of corruption, or tribunals are decided by armed men, and our houses are pillaged. I have heard of these things, said Sultan. Then arose in the divan a valiant judge of Asia and Arab by birth, and he drew his sabre and cried, "My Padishah, the only cure for all these things is the edge of the sword." At these words, the Sultan and the whole assembly fixed their eyes on the Arabian judge, who stood before them with flashing eyes and weeping, but said no more. The declaration of the judge was registered, and then all present, the Sultan, the viziers, the mufti, and the chief officers signed a written manifesto by which they bound themselves to suppress and abuses and maintain public order, under the penalty of bringing on their heads the curses of God, the Prophet, of all angels, and of all true believers. Amra had need of acts as well as of words, and the work of that speedily began. Energetic and trusty emissaries were sent through Constantinople, who slew the leaders of the late insurrection and all whom Amurath marked for destruction. The troops, deprived of their chiefs and suspicious of each other, trembled and obeyed. The same measures were taken in the provinces, and for many months the, the sword and the bowstring were incessantly active. But it was the capital and the Amurath's own eye that the revenge of royalty for its long humiliation reaped the bloodiest harvest. Every morning the Bosphorus threw up on its shores the corpses of those who had been executed during the preceding night, and in them the anxious spectators recognized the emissaries and spies whom they had lately seen parading the streets in all the haughtiness of military license. The personal appearance and courage of Amurath, his bold and material demeanors confirmed the respect and awe which the strenuous ferocity inspired, who was in the 20th year of his age, and saw but little above the middle stature. His bodily frame united strength and activity in a remarkable degree. His features were regular and handsome. His aquiline nose and the jet black beard which had begun to grace his chin gave dignity to his aspect, but the imperious lustre of his full dark eyes was marred by an habitual frown, which, however, suited well the sternness of his character. Every day he displayed his horsemanship in the hippodrome, and he won the involuntary admiration of the soldiery by his strength and skill as a cavalier and swordsman, and by his unrivalled force and dexterity in the use of the bow. He patrolled the streets in disguise at night, and often with his own hand struck dead the offenders against his numerous edicts in matters of police. If any menacing assemblage began to form in any of the streets, the Sultan received speedy speedy tidings from his numerous spies, and before revolt could be matured, Amurath was on the spot, well armed, and with a trusty guard of the choice troops. He rode fearlessly in among the groups of Sipahis or Janissaries, who slunk in savage silence from before their sultan, each dreading lest then keen Ayeshold recognize and mark him, and that unforgiving lip pronounce his doom. The insurrection in Asia Minor had been quelled in 1630 by the defeat and submission of Abaza, whom Amurath had spared principally out of sympathy with his hatred towards the Janissaries, and had made Pasha of Bosnia. He now employed that able the ruthless chief in Constantinople, and appointed him Aga of his old enemies in Janissaries. Abaza served his stern master well in that perilous station, but he at last incurred the displeasure of Amurath, and was executed in 1634. The habit of blood-shedding had now grown into a second nature with the Sultan. All faults, small or great, were visited by him with the same short, sharp, and final sentence, and the least shade of suspicion that crossed his restless mind was sufficient to ensure its victim's doom. He struck before the censured, and at last the terror with which he was regarded was so general and profound that men who were summoned to the Sultan's presence commonly made the deed ablution before they entered the palace. The career of Amurath is a memorable proof of how perilously the possession of unlimited power tempts first to excessive severity for real wrongs, next to ruthless haste in punishing for imaginary offenses, and finally to the practice of inhuman cruelty on the slightest suspicion or vexation. The earliest executions which Amurath ordered when he assumed independent power were those of traitors and mutineers whose, whose guilt was as heinous as it was unquestionable. His slaughters grew more sweeping, but still for a long time his cruelty was seldom or never awakened out of mere wantonness or caprice. It was against real or suspected state offenders that the imperial manslayer exercised his terrible prerogative during the first 2 years and his actual sovereignty, but, by degrees his temper grew more moody and human life became as nothing in his eyes. When he rode forth an unfortunate wretch who displaced by him by crossing or impeding the road was instantly put to death and frequently fell pierced by an arrow from the gloomy despot's own bow. He once caused a party of women who he saw dancing in a meadow to be seized and drowned because their noisy merriment disturbed him. At another time a boat with many females on board passed along the Bosphorus nearer to the walls of the seraglio than he thought proper, He ordered the batteries to open on them, and they were sent to the bottom before his eyes. He beheaded his chief musician for singing a Persian air, which he said was doing an honor to the enemies of the empire. Many other acts of equal atrocity are recorded of him, and the number of those who died by his command is reckoned at 100,000. Among them were three of his brothers, and, as was generally believed, his deposed uncle Mustafa. One of his sayings is preserved by an Italian writer who asserts that Amurat's favorite book was The Prince of Machiavelli, which had been translated into Turkish. The Sultan's own maxim is certainly worthy of such inspiration. It is this: when gains never grows, this rip decree, decrepit through the may grow grey. In the last years of Murad's life, his ferocity of temper was fearfully aggravated by the habits of intoxication which he acquired in one of his nocturnal preambulations of the capital. He met a drunkard named Mustafa Bekir, who entered into conversation with him and boasted that he possessed that which would purchase all Constantinople, and the son of a slave himself. The son of a slave is a term by which the Turkish people often speak of the Sultan. In the morning Amurath sent for the man and reminded him of his words. Nothing daunted, Bekir drew a flask of wine from his robe and held it out of the Sultan, saying, "Here is the liquid gold which outweighs all the treasures of the universe, which makes a beggar more glorious than a king, and turns the Medi-sent fakir into a horned Alexander." Struck with the confidence and joyous spirit of the bold Bacchanal, Amurath drained the flask, and thenceforth Mustafa Bekir and the Sultan were boon companions. When the plague was in 1637 carrying off 500 victims daily at Constantinople, Amurath often passed his nights in review with his favorite. "This summer," he said, "God is punishing the rogues. Perhaps by winter he will come to the honest men." Never, however, did Amurath wholly lose in habits of indulgence, of vigor, of either mind or body. When civil or military duty required his vigilance, none could surpass him in austere abstemiousness or in the capacity for labor. And with all his misdeeds he saved his country. He tolerated no crimes but his own. The worst of evils, the sway of petty local tyrants, ceased under his dominion. He was unremittingly and unrelentingly watchful in visiting the offences of all who were in authority under him, as well as those of the mass of his subjects, and the worst tyranny of the single despot was a far less grievous curse of the empire than had been the military anarchy which he quelled. Order and Subordination were restored under his iron sway. There was discipline in the camp, there was pure justice on the tribunals, the revenues were fairly raised and honestly administered. The abuses of the feudal system of the Ziamets and Timars were extirpated, and if Amurath was dreaded at home, he made himself still more feared by the foe abroad.